Everyone, and a very warm welcome to you. Welcome to Curious About Innovation, brought to you by the Glasgow Science Centre. My name is Veronica, and I'm going to be your host for this session. Now, in a moment, we're going to see a video from Skyrora, which is an aerospace manufacturing company specialising in space launches. That's right, specialising in rockets. It's pretty cool. Now, that's going to be featuring the Business Operations Manager, Derek Harris. And we are lucky enough to have Derek Harris here for a live Q&A to answer all of your questions after the video. If you would like to ask a question, then all you need to do is pop it in the comment section down below and we will ask that question for you. But for the moment, please enjoy this presentation.
My name is Derek Harris. I'm the Business Operations Manager at Skyrora. What that means is my day-to-day job is to make sure that the company can work, whether it be the engineering side or the business side, and to overcome issues that may be including export and import, legal documents that I would work with our legal team to solve, finding of locations, and many, many other tasks. So Skyrora's main aim is to place satellites into space using our small launch vehicle. However, that is only a small amount of the work that we do. We use a lot of innovation to do this, so we work towards bringing innovations in 3D printing, advanced manufacturing, and other engineering techniques. On top of that, we do a lot of outreach to try and help establish the sector as a job that people would like to have, as well as just basically pushing space as a whole to everyone and trying to get everyone excited about the UK becoming a space station again. Scotland's the most ideal place, I think, for launching rockets from, not only just due to our geographic sense for our inclinations into polar and sun-synchronous orbit, but the people, the creativity, the innovation, and just the history we've got in engineering really makes Scotland a sound base for space. Scotland is going to be a key player in the UK space industry going forward, not just because of the launch ourselves, the rocket companies here, but you also have all the satellites being built through in Glasgow by the likes of Clyde Space and Alba Orbital. And then if you look at all the companies in and around the central belt which have the data analytic knowledge, so the likes of Ecometrica, for example, they are all based in Scotland as well. So Scotland is going to be a big part of the space sector in the UK. So for myself, the biggest influence on me sort of pushing it into this role since I came on board is just all the talented people that are around me. When I first joined and meeting the likes of our engineering team and hearing how we can use simple chemicals to help get us into outer space, and it just blew my mind, if you pardon the pun. And it was great to see the passion that they had, and that sort of rubbed off on myself. And that passion has sort of kept me driving through to try and make sure the company's successful and the whole sector is successful. My favourite part of the job has to be the outreach with myself. I love to sort of speak with the universities, the primary schools, the high schools, to try and encourage the next generation to come in. It's easy for us to have some of the best and brightest talent on board at the moment, but going forward the industry is going to need a lot more. So being able to say that I maybe speak to one or two people who end up in the industry is a big thing for me. So it's the outreach that I absolutely adore. Well, I think communication is key. So being able to talk, whether it is in a team, between each other in a department, You may have to speak to different stakeholders at different levels. So being confident to go and speak with whether it's government ministers, other businesses, regulators, these are all important key tools to have. On top of that, critical thinking. So whether it's an engineering problem or a business problem that you need to sort out, so logistics, for example, of getting the launch vehicle from Edinburgh to a spaceport, for example, because the spaceport's being on an island up in Shetland and the Western Isles, you need to figure out how to get your vehicle there safely and intact. So the critical thinking and making sure you're organised with that is a main thing. So those would be the three key, I would say: communications, critical thinking, and organisation. Well, this year is going to be a big year for Skyrora. You'll hear some big announcements going on, so hopefully some future launches, which you may get to see video footage of in the near future. Announcements of more jobs to come, and an increase in factories and workshop size. So there's a lot to come from this year, but as I say, 2021 is going to be the year of Skyrora. So please follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and you'll see all the updates as they happen.
Video. Thank you again so much for sending that in to us and taking part. Now, if you want to ask any questions of Derek Harris that was featured in that video, make sure to pop them down below. And we are lucky enough to have Derek Harris with us. Welcome to you.
Good morning. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm doing really, really well. I really enjoyed that video. Was it fun to do?
It was very much fun. It was nice to be back in the office. So, and knowing I was going to such a good cause, it was a delight to do.
I see now. Was that a rocket behind you in the video?
It was. The rocket behind us is our XL, which will be our main vehicle for taking flights into orbit, and it's just a large model of it that we take around to trade shows and such.
It looks pretty cool. Well, apart from my questions, I've got a lot of questions for you, but we've got some questions coming in for you as well. The very first one is, what kind of jobs do satellites do in orbit around the Earth?
Oh, that's a very good question. So satellites there's many different jobs that they do. If you want to take it to the sort of top scale of things, you can see that they do a lot of what we call Earth observation. And Earth observation is looking down on the Earth to try and provide solutions for different things. So what I mean by that is you could have them monitoring the polar ice caps for melting, or you could have them watching for migrations of animals, or I've even heard of farmers having basically little dongles that they can put into their tractors, which the satellite data tells them which bits are ready to plough and bring up the potatoes, for example, and which bits to leave and keep going and need another week or two. So these are the high levels of that. Other levels, you've got your actual data and such. So anyone that plays mobile games, Fortnite on their mobile phone, things like this, you have communication data that comes via satellites as well. So it's a very broad spectrum of tasks that these satellites can carry out.
That's amazing. I didn't realize the type of jobs that satellites could do and how intricate they could be as well. We've got another question here. What makes a location ideal for a launch?
Well, for location for launch, some of the biggest things you need in regards to that is space. So it sounds funny that you need space to get into space, but it's true. Basically, you don't want to be sending it off in the middle of Edinburgh or Glasgow because there's far too many people around, and obviously, if anything goes wrong, there would be damage there. But your biggest point for it is where you can get into orbit from. So if you look at most of the spaceports in and around the world, they all are pretty close to the equator, and that's because it's a little bit easier to launch from there.
Right.
Whereas Scotland has a slight difference. We have orbits which are called sun-synchronous orbits and polar orbits, which are now in demand for smaller satellites which deal with the communication and Earth observation. So this makes Scotland an actual ideal place to launch these types of vehicles from.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's something that's there's nowhere else in the world that can really do this than Scotland is basically been pushing this forward. Otherwise, if they need to launch them from, say, the normal American spaceports and such, they then need to figure out how to get into these orbits, which then causes a lot more technical difficulty for the companies.
Yeah. That's really cool. I've been over to America to watch a launch myself. Is there any way that we can watch launches here?
Yeah, certainly. With Skyrora for ourselves at the moment, we've been concentrating on de-risking. So we've been building up our vehicle sizes. So we have vehicles on our social media and on our YouTube channels and such. But as things go ahead with the spaceports in Shetland and Spaceport One, which is in the Isles, they both have plans to have sort of tourist centres where people can watch when these launches kick off in a year or two's time.
That would be amazing. Well, you've got one visitor definitely booked in if that happens. I'll be definitely up to watch that. We have another question for you. Scotland has a long history of being at the forefront of technology and engineering. It must be exciting to take part of that history. Where do you see aerospace careers going in the future within Scotland?
That is a great question.
It's a very good question.
I think the big thing with aerospace careers is people don't actually realise how many there are. When people think aerospace at the moment, they think engineers to build rockets or build satellites. What people aren't realising is Scotland is actually the biggest data centre for space data in the world. So Edinburgh University has huge amounts of data that comes back, and you've got companies like Ecometrica, who are through in Edinburgh, and other companies across Dundee Star in Dundee, and that use this data. So to be a space career, you could be a data analyst. On top of that, you've got lawyers. So we have a lawyer, Laura, and she is our head of legal. So we now need space lawyers. We need health and safety, administration, even medics. Actually, that's one that's not really thought about. So you have space medics, people that work out, astronauts, so when they're up in space, react to certain things. And because if you think about it, if you get a sore tummy up in space, you can't really go to a doctor, so you need your medics back on the ground to do this. So all these careers are sort of beginning to get bigger and can all be sort of find a pathway from Scotland at one of the universities and such.
So it's not just rocket scientists. You can be a whole bunch of that thing. That's amazing. That's really cool. It's really interesting. Now, our next question for you. For those interested in pursuing a career in aerospace, what educational path would you recommend?
Again, another good question. If you want to do anything with engineering, physics. To go into university, you need physics for any courses if you're doing engineering. So if that's the way you want to, make sure you have that. On top of that, it then depends which way. So if you want to go down the medical route, as we just spoke about, you would need biology. But I think just your core sciences and your STEM subjects, so your science, technology, English, math, just sort of making sure you've got a good ground base in all of these should be able to get you into any subject you would like to with the universities. On top of that, look around for volunteer situations. You may have companies in your area, if you write to them, they might say, come and visit us, or yeah, we can maybe do a high school work experience, things like this. So just try and find out who's in your local area, investigate, and I wouldn't want to say annoy them, but contact them. See, most people are sitting there and they're just out. People don't know they're there, so they don't know how to interact with the schools and such. So if you reach out, that you'll be unaware of how happy they are a lot of the time to try and get involved.
Right. So your advice is just to get involved. And if you don't ask, you don't get. So just may as well ask to see if you can get involved somehow. Now, the next questions that we have are some from YouTube. Oh, from Tinky Strider. Have you got any plans to launch any probes? And that's from Edinburgh.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that, Tinky. So in regards to that, we won't be launching probes as such. So we will be launching satellites for clients. So small satellites that are roughly go from the size of a toaster up to maybe the size of a small car engine, which will be launched from the UK. What we are looking into is we have a space tug. So a space tug is a vehicle that's on top of in the rocket. So once we release our satellites, we can go around and do additional missions. So that could be to refuel other satellites. It could be to deorbit some of the space trash and other satellites that may be dead. So we have those sort of options, but that's the closest to a pro moment that we have designed.
That's really cool. We've got some more questions from YouTube about to appear on our screen, I'm assuming. Oh, it's from Chris Banks, our video on Chris Banks. I've heard you are working on sustainable aerospace fuel. That sounds amazing. How was that developed?
Well, was a little bit of a funny story, to be honest with you. So we were all celebrating one of our recent milestones, and we were looking on the television on the background. There was a news article about the gentleman Boyan Slat, who is out in San Francisco and collecting trash out there from the Pacific trash patch. And we're like, it would be great if you could actually do anything with this plastics, which are being brought back and sort of taken out of the ocean. And one of our chemical engineers took that on board. We didn't know at the time, and then came back a few weeks later and said, I've got an idea. And his idea was to take these previously unrecycled plastics, things that we don't tend to recycle, so polystyrene, the things that your TV and washing machine, video games, consoles all come in. They're protected, so the white sort of baubles and peanuts. Only about I think between 2 and 5% of that is actually recycled. So they decided to see what they could do with that, and then other plastics that weren't normally recycled. And they've came through a 3-step process, which means instead of them now going to landfill or to be incinerated, we can go through this 3-step process, and for every 1,000 kilograms of fuel, we get 600 kilos of fuel, which include rocket fuel to fuel our vehicles.
That's incredible. That's absolutely incredible. That's fantastic. I'm absolutely blown away by that. That's really cool. Our next question is, you mentioned as part of your job, you enjoy the part of the job. You mentioned that the part of your job you enjoy the most is outreach to places like universities. What does your outreach program involve, and how do you gain interest?
Well, we have various different types of outreach for that purpose. So one, for example, is we work with Glasgow Caledonian University. We act as a mentor to GU Rocketry. So they're looking to take part in some of the competitions for rocketry in America, which I think it's Spaceport America it's called. So we've given them a mentor from our technical team who helps them with any trouble that they may come up across on designs and such with that. Then on the other side, from the younger routes, we do sort of, from primary schools, we'll go in and do visits and take some of the rockets with us, or the smaller vehicles with us, with the local high schools. So I'm based in Edinburgh, and to a couple of high schools in the area, which we've just talked about the whole things, the whole ecosystem of space. So with, as I said earlier, the data standpoints, the launch, the satellites, and obviously the spaceport. So we try and just educate to what's there to try and inspire people if they want to actually come into the industry. As of maybe 5 years ago, if you thought of space, everyone just thought of SpaceX or NASA. No one knew that the UK really had such a strong sector.
Again, brilliant answer. Now we have another question on YouTube. It's about to appear on our screen for me to read. As a company, how large is Skyrora? How many rockets do you launch annually? Is Scotland a big player in the space industry?
Excellent. Well, I'll cover the Scotland part first. So Scotland was an unknown quantity up until maybe a few years ago, and that was just due to bad or poor communication. No one realised how many space camps Scotland has. So you have the likes of Gore, who are in Dundee, and they supply the wires to NASA for all the NASA rockets. As I said, Ecometrica does data on rainforest and such. And now that you have launch and the spaceports coming into it, you have a full circle of everything you need to have a space industry in Scotland. So Scotland is going to be huge in years coming forward when it comes to space. They're basically going to be the European hub, I would expect, for that. In regards to the amount of rockets that we launch annually at this moment in time, because we're using the smaller vehicles, that varies. So maybe between 3 and 4 a year. But when we get to our larger vehicles, it'll be an upscaling. So from 2022 next year, we expect 1 of our large vehicles to go. Then the next gain year, we would expect 3. And by the time we get to full production and to keep all the clients happy, we expect to have 16 vehicles launching a year from the UK. And in regards to our size, so we are only 3.5 years old. So about 3 years ago, there was 5 of us in an office in Edinburgh with not very much space. And today we have we have around 6 different buildings and workshops, offices. So we're in Slovakia, Bulgaria, Iceland, Scotland. We have 3 workshops in Scotland. So Edinburgh, one that's soon to be announced, and one just outside of Edinburgh, as well as our test sites. And the UK staff at the moment come up to, I want to say, about 55 people, and our overseas staff comes to about 100 at the moment. But we are, with that new factory that we're about to announce, that will bring up to 300 jobs into Scotland.
That's a lot bigger than I expected, and you're across the entire world. That's amazing. Now, thank you very much to Cargillfield School in Edinburgh for that question. Now, the next question is from Derek Sherlaw. I hear it's getting quite congested in the space around Earth. Who decides/regulates what satellites to be put into space?
So at the moment, if anyone would like to place a satellite into space, they need to get permission from their government. They register their satellites against the main register. The thing is, Derek's correct. It is getting quite congested up there for the flight purposes. So we are needing to be a bit more careful with this. We need to make sure that companies are taking responsibility to deorbit, and deorbit just means to take out of space again the ones that are no longer in use. So, for example, in 1971, so 50 years ago this year, Britain's last rocket launch was Black Arrow, and it launched Prospero, which was the satellite. And Prospero's been up there for 50 years, and I think it's something like the last 10 to 20 years it's not actually been working. So it's just been floating up there, taking up space. So the idea behind our space tug that we were talking about earlier is that we can help try and free up some of this space. And there's other companies like Astroscale and Deorbit who have similar innovations coming forward and are going to look to try and clean the environment up in orbit. After all, a lot of what we're looking to launch is to protect the Earth and protect the environment on the Earth. So we need to protect the environment above the Earth as well.
That's really good to hear. What happens to the satellites once they're recovered?
So if they're recovered, they are normally burned up on re-entry. So when they come in to the atmosphere, because of how they're built, everything burns up, and if anything does come down, it ends up being about the size of maybe a 5 pence piece or a 1 pence piece. But it depends on the type of satellite and the size of satellite. But most of them burn up without any real issue, and that's when you see at night what looks kind of like shooting stars. Sometimes it's not meteors; it can be old space debris that's burning up.
And will you be personally granting all the wishes that people wish on those shooting stars?
Well, I wish I could, but I know there's a few out there that we can't. But I'm sure we grant a few wishes in a few years and have a few people that are watching this join us.
Excellent. So our next question is, what if someone wants to specifically work for Skyrora? Do you have any programs available that could be an advantage? What does that involve?
Well, at present, we have taken on graduate apprentices from Heriot-Watt University. And a graduate apprentice is someone who spends 4 days with industry. So they spend 4 days working with us and 1 day at the university. And at the end of the 4 or 5 year course, they get their degree, but they've also had the hands-on experience with the company and in the industry. So that's one of the programs we've got at the moment. When we open up this next factory, as I said, that we're due to announce pretty soon, with those 300 jobs, a portion of them have been put aside for these sort of graduate apprentice schemes and sort of what would you call them? Sort of scholarships or internships, things like this, so we can try and keep people being trained up in Scotland. After all, after Black Arrow stopped 50 years ago and that launch program stopped, we lost a lot of skills. So for us, it's important to try and redevelop these skills internally and keep them in the country. So graduate apprentice schemes are about the best ones that we can say at the moment. So if anyone at the moment is thinking about going into university, it's worth speaking to not only Heriot-Watt, because other universities do that, and then you speak to the university about them, contact ourselves. If we have space, our engineering team and such would have an interview, and if you would mix in well with the culture and we have a position, it is something that would put a good chance of happening in that regard. So it just depends how many roles we've got open at the time for those sort of positions.
Excellent. Again, one of those things, if you don't ask, you don't get. I'm sure lots of people right now will be really excited to learn about that. Now it's back to YouTube for another question. Can you talk about the stages involved in rocket launches? Do you build your own rockets, and how do they transport satellites into space? And that's from Kirklefield School in Edinburgh.
Excellent. Again, that's a very, very good question. So every rocket is slightly different from company-wise. So your NASA, your SpaceX all use different fuels. So we do build our own vehicles in-house. So at the moment, they are being produced. They're being produced in just outside of Edinburgh, and then when this new production facility, the mass production will move to there. So when you're building a rocket, it goes through a lot of testing. So if you were to look on our YouTube channel or our social media, you can see engine tests. So we go through what's called non-destructive testing on our tanks. So non-destructive testing is basically to make sure the tanks are strong enough for going to space for pressure. So what we do with that is we super pressure the tanks to the point where we try to make them explode. So we know what pressure we need to survive in space, but we try and crank that up by maybe 10-20% to make sure that there's anything wrong with the tanks, it shows there while on Earth, so there's no difficulty when it comes to launch. So after all these sort of testing regimes have been done, the vehicles are fully put together and transported to a launch site. So for example, we'll take Shetland, we go up to Shetland, we have a mobile launcher, which means the vehicle goes in the back of a lorry. It has to travel a little bit slower than your normal traffic, so if you ever get stuck behind us, I do apologise. It gets taken to the launch site, and at that there's a few other tests as well. Once they have all been passed and we're ready for launch, this is the scenes you'll be used to seeing on the TV. There's 3 stages in the actual vehicle. So for ourselves, our bottom stage has 9 engines, and as it starts, that takes the most thrust to get off the Earth. So the hardest part is to get something moving. So if anyone's ever tried to push a car, for example, you'll know once it moves, it's easy to keep going. But trying to get it started to roll is just a nightmare. So it's the same trying to get the rocket to leave Earth and it will move up. But once it's had all that thrust to be in movement and go up, that section will drop off. And then the second section has a single engine, and it will push up to another certain height. Then it releases again, and that leaves the top path, which is the cone that you see. And that cone or fairing has the satellites in there. So at this point, this is maneuvering to where it needs to be in orbit. The fairings will open, and then it has a dispenser which sort of ejects the satellites into the orbit that they need to be in. So all of this is done through the engines, but the biggest thing for the engines is the fuels and the oxidizers they use, because when you go to space, there's no oxygen that can burn, so you need to take that oxygen with you. So we use kerosene or ecosene, as we discussed earlier, as our fuel. So that's what burns. And to take the oxygen with us, we use hydrogen peroxide. So hydrogen peroxide, very low distillation amount, say 3% to 5%, is used in anything from hair dyes to chemical cleaners, so hand wash, things like this. But we use it super distilled and super strong at 98%. But what the magic is with that is HTP breaks down to being, if we talk about chemicals and chemical makeup, is water plus an extra oxygen molecule. So what happens is when we push this through our engines, it gets super excited and splits up into water and oxygen. So the oxygen burns with our fuel, and then what you see is steam that comes out as our thing. So it actually looks like it's levitating rather than smoke. So that is really what pushes and the main chemical outputs that help put the satellites and the vehicles into orbit.
That's so clever. Yeah, that's so clever. That's why you get paid the big bucks, I suppose, and get to do all this cool launch stuff. That's because you're so clever. So we've got another question here. What's the coolest thing you've ever launched into space?
Well, we've yet to break the 100-kilometer line, which is technically the Kármán line, which is what we would dedicate as space. But we have launched a few fun things over the time. So we have actually launched cryptocurrency once. So a hard drive was cryptocurrency in one of the first launches. Beyond that, at the moment, a lot of the things that we have launched are just additional electronics and things that are going into the main vehicle. We have been speaking with clients for some of our larger vehicles that will go across the 100 kilometers line. So the sort of things we're looking at to go into space, we've been talking to whiskey distributors and things like this, just to have them on board and again highlight Scotland, other key industries, and try and make Scotland as famous for space as it is for whiskey, basically.
That would be really cool, just to launch things into space just for fun. Back to YouTube. Tom asks, do you graduate apprenticeship schemes involve subject areas other than engineering? For example, would you take on apprentices in business and finance?
At this present moment in time, we've not actually taken anyone on in business and finance for graduate apprenticeships. However, this year is the first year we've actually done internships for those for business and finance. So I believe in the near future, it'll be something that we will take a look at. At present, as I say, the internship has been the first sort of step to that, and we've had a lot of good candidates come forward for that, and we're hoping to announce the winners of that internship in the near future. So I would say watch this space. I do expect graduate apprentice schemes will open up for other areas of the business, not just engineering.
That's really exciting. It's another one of those things you don't ask, you don't get. So it's back to YouTube for another question. Let's see. From Tara Gibson, is there anything you found out whilst doing your work which was very unexpected or surprising?
Well, I think the best thing I can say, what I've found when we've been doing things is when we've been doing the smaller vehicles, we go to recover them. So once they've been up at 30, 40 kilometers, they come down with a parachute. They're normally about a mile or two, 3, 4 away from where you've launched from. So because we've tended to do these in the highlands, we've actually, you'll cut across the highlands to try and find vehicles using the trackers. So for me, it's been pretty cool going across and seeing the wildlife, to be honest with you. So seeing all the natural stags, and I actually saw an adder for the first time up in the highlands. Yeah, I seen it, and I almost ran a mile, if I'm honest. I was looking down at my foot and seen this thing slither towards it. I'm like, oh no, and just instantly ran further up the path. But for me, that's been some of the coolest things that I've seen and learned during the launch. But besides that, because I'm not an engineer, I'm more business sided, to be able to learn like how our engines work and things like that. We've got some great people on the team. So we have the likes of Robin and JJ who run our engineering teams, and they've been able to explain to me so I can come to things like this and talk about our engines properly and explain how they work and fully understand it. So things like that have been so great to learn while working in the role as well.
That's really exciting. Right, another one from YouTube. You're getting people really involved. So I'd love to see this. Derek Charlotte, in the future, do you see rockets being launched from Scotland to put satellites into orbit around the moon or other objects in space?
Good question, Derek. So yeah, in regards to orbit around the moon, there are discussions ongoing with that, and that's not just Skyrora. That's a lot of different companies wondering, and that's all to do for further movement to Mars and such. If we're going to use the moon as a sort of stopping point or a lay-by, for lack of a better term, they will then need some sort of satellites in orbit with that. And I know there's some companies that are wanting to orbit it to just do similar observations to the moon that they do on Earth. So I do foresee we'll see things happening with that. Will they come from Scotland? That might be too early to say at the moment, but it's something, again, I would keep our eyes peeled for. The second part of that question is, what other things do I see going in? Well, there are little probes and things being designed by companies for things such as asteroid mining. Right. You've got, as I said, the debris clearing companies, and I'm sure there'll be other inventions to come. But the good thing about where I'm sitting is, at the moment, I'm looking at the up and coming generation and the innovations coming through the university and all the bright ideas coming. There's so much things that could happen. So we're hearing of being able to gather space debris and that sort of materials with them and then reuse them, whether it be Mars or the moon. So there's lots of ideas going about. So I think we're back to a stage that the sky's the limit, and it's the only thing that would hold us back would be people's innovation and ideas.
That would be really interesting, and it would be really exciting to be part of something like a project like that. It'd be really cool. Now it's back onto YouTube for another question. What has been your most successful and exciting launch? It's Cargill Field School in Edinburgh.
Well, for that one, that was a easy one for me. So last year we were in Iceland, launching the largest of the vehicles that we've launched so far, Skylark Micro. And we were basically about a mile outside the Arctic Circle where we were launching. And I know we were all prepared to go, and we weren't really aware of what was going to happen when you're there. Anytime you're launching, there's so many bits on a vehicle, something can always go wrong. But for us, we went there, we were sure we had everything right, and it took a few days for the launch to go ahead because the first day we were ready, but then the wind was too strong, so we couldn't go. And then there was issues with the tracking from the satellites on the next day. So it took 3 days to eventually get it launched. But when it launched, it went up. We had the whole local town from Iceland there searching on the hillside. And it was just such a great experience with that. And we got on very well with the local town. So if you can imagine, you're lucky if there was maybe about 100, 200 houses there. There was a petrol station, a small store, and a restaurant pub. That was basically everything in the town, and a school, sorry. And that was it. So it was such a small area for us to come up there with such excitement for them. But again, from the outreach point of view, we got to do a little bit with them and to sort of help inspire the kids there and to see this actual launch in person. It was just such a great experience. And you throw on top of that being in Iceland during the summer where the sun doesn't go down really. So it was never dark. It was always light. sort of thing when we were there. So it was such a surreal experience, but that has to be the best one so far.
That certainly sounds like an adventure. I'm a little bit jealous of that experience. I would love to have seen that. Um, so another question from Edinburgh. It sounds like you're getting them super excited. Let's see what that question is. Have you ever had something go wrong with one of your launches? How did you deal with that situation? If so.
Yeah, so it's actually more common than you would expect, especially with the smaller vehicles. So I think the biggest one I've just mentioned there would have been with the micro with the wind. So if the wind on the smaller vehicles gets a certain amount, you then have to pull your launch window. We get a lot of data from the weather, the Met Service and such. So we can see what the wind speeds are, the predicted speeds. Normally, if anything like that goes wrong, we just launch for that time window because we normally have a window which is a few hours to do it in.
Mm-hmm.
Other occasions, as I said, the next day we were having issues with the satellite connecting up with the trackers. So some trackers we put in use satellite data, funnily enough, to show where they are. But at this point, for some reason, it couldn't get a big connection. So for them to work, they need to connect to more than one satellite. So this wasn't working. So what we thought was maybe it was the electronics that we had in the vehicle. What we have is we have spares with us. So the team went and replaced it, took it out, put the new one in. It worked, looked like it was working perfectly. A couple of minutes later, again, same thing. And it was then that we were looking into what could be going wrong, and we were checking sort of GPS positioning using an iPhone, of all things. And it was basically saying it couldn't give us GPS because it wasn't getting enough satellites confirming the area. And we realized it wasn't our technology. So the biggest thing is safety first is our thing. We look to see what's there, and if there's anything, we just pause. We just don't launch. We go back, we look at it, whether that means taking the vehicle completely to pieces or looking at certain parts. That is basically what we would do with that, and it's what we've done with everything so far. So every vehicle that we have has launched great and been recovered, but that is why, in that regards, is because we're that cautious when we do the launches. Obviously, when we get larger and larger, it's going to be a bit harder to strip down the entire vehicles, but there'll be a lot more computer and electronics which will tell us what the problems are back at the command center. So it'll be a similar thing where we'll just stop the launch, we'll get the team out, the engineers out, make it the site safe, and then try and find out what it is before launches. So we've not had anything catastrophic or anything really bad happen, and it's all because of these safety measures.
Excellent. Right, we've got time for just one more question. From Squad Kids, what are your plans for the future?
Well, for myself and the company, I hope to see over the next 5 years the company grow. As I said, with the new production workshop coming, I want to try and help bring in some more younger people with some experienced heads. So I want to see the industry grow. A few years ago, it was of the engineer, and there was something like 18,000 jobs unfilled. We are now bringing a new sector in that uses engineers. And for me, I feel that it's our company responsibility to try and engage with people to try and make sure we have enough engineers and enough people wanting to come into the industry. But not just that, we have a lot of responsibilities regarding the environment, whether it's in orbit or on the ground. So we have to strive to make sure that we're as environmentally responsible as possible. So for my plans for the next year is to get us properly launching, but also make sure that we're as sustainable and environmentally friendly as humanly possible, and to try and make sure that we work towards that and push the industry towards that as well.
That's really nice to hear that you're not only ensuring that the differences that you're making to the climate not only that, with the careers and the space industry within Scotland, that you're ensuring that as well. That's really nice to hear. Well, it's been wonderful talking to you today. It's been really exciting. It's been a highlight for me this year. I really, really enjoyed it. And thank you to everyone at home for joining us for Curious About Innovation. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Thanks again to Mr. Hannes and Skyrora for joining us today. And we'll see you for the next session. Thanks again.